Tom, can you put up one of the quadrant slides? Yes, right here. And I want to ask both of you this. This class, we have all taught on campus in front of the students. This class today is not, it's remote. Where does on campus fall in that quadrant, and where does remote learning, and what does that do to impact and add power again back to the student? Where do those two go?
So that's an interesting question for me, because I think what we're asking is, you know, what's an educational omnichannel strategy?
Exactly. It's exactly what I was going to do without saying yes.
No, I think it's absolutely. And what I hear, and I'd be interested to hear what Lionel said from students, is that just like going to the store or, you know, shopping online, we have, it's different moments in time in your life what feels good. If you're busy working, then, you know, not being tied to a schedule or a specific location becomes really important. The flexibility of and the automation becomes more important. We have students that tell me over and over that they miss interaction not only with their professors, I'm sure they love that part, but also with the other students a lot. And then there's a community, so that kind of piece. And then I think, like with any retailer, whether online or offline, is how you execute that, you know. So, you know, we have, you know, online programs, and some of which, and I would throw some guilt on my own side on this, could be a lot more interesting, I think, than simply doing a Zoom kind of a lecture. And so certainly that's one of the things that we're looking at improving. How do you improve the experience? How do you add that hedonic element into it? How do you make it fun? I mean, if you shop, it's fun. I mean, consumers for decades have said they are very happy, satisfied with shopping in a supermarket. But then you ask them, is it fun to shop? And typically they say no. And I would argue, when someone is not having fun at an activity, if you give them a choice, you're likely you're going to lose them. And I think that's part of what we see today. So great question, Craig.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I might stab at it. You know, I'm not in education, so I'm a total amateur. But I mean, my thought would be the homogeneous product side of this would be sort of your standard marketing 101 textbook course, right? Which is fairly homogeneous and is interchangeable, and you know, you can easily deliver that educational product in a sort of fairly standard way. But, you know, this kind of a much more nuanced discussion we're having is more heterogeneous, and it's dependent on individuals like us, right? You know, thinkers and writers, and then also, yeah, and then the fun of interacting in a live classroom environment is really irreplaceable. You know, it's completely heterogeneous, right? Because you can interacting with your professor and your other students and having a really fun discussion, you know, in person, you cannot just homogenize that. So that's the value of in-person classroom, I would think. So I would say, yeah, your sort of standard, you know, your sort of basic baseline entry-level classes, you know, can be delivered remotely. But yeah, I mean, you know, you can't replace live discussion. I mean, you can try to with Zoom like we're doing now, but it would be a lot more fun if we were in a coffee shop having a coffee and hanging out.
Indeed.
You know?
Yeah, and my point of that was I really wanted, for the students' benefit, to understand the power of what you've created here, because as you well know, you could write another book just about this quadrant system. And you could apply it to many, many different things. And I didn't want the students to miss that we started out doing this related to omnichannel in retail, and you quickly brought up, but you could speak omnichannel based to the media experience and the way in which we engage and learn and everything else. But you could also take the same chart and apply it to education and higher education and K through 12 education. You could apply it to most any aspect of your life, your vacation. Now that air travel isn't as ubiquitous as it was, or going to the hotel or camping, or do you still do Airbnb or do you not? I mean, there isn't anything in my life I can't think that I could not apply this quadrant to. And so I'm thrilled I met Lionel Binnie today and I've got this quadrant because I'm going to use it, but I will give you credit for doing it. But I didn't want students to miss that.
Yeah, just give me credit, please.
We will.
Do you mind at all, since we're coming to our end of time here, if we allow the students to have your email and they could reach out to you if they have questions on this, or even thoughts surrounding this, or even a comment on our discussion?
Yeah, no, I'm very happy to be available to, have dialogue about this with anyone. Yeah, I enjoy it. Yeah.
Wonderful. Good. Great.
Well, Lionel, thank you very much. This is great. It's great to, I see this as a beginning because I love sharing ideas, and we live in a time of change, and I think it's an exciting time to be in business, and having some fresh ways to look at how do we provide value to consumers and how do we capture value as companies, I think is great. I love working with the folks that we have around the university, and I'd love for you to be part of that.
Well, thank you so much. Yeah, and I would love to collaborate with either of you guys on any of this stuff, because I know this, these models can be improved, of course, and having dialogue is what sharpens things up. So your question, Tom, about the, what is a partic fella really homogeneous? I mean, you could argue it many ways. These models could be much further improved, and you could also validate it with actual research, like I said, Nielsen data.
Yeah, that would be interesting. We should talk about that. That might be something that.
I mean, I could, frankly, you could do a PhD on this. I mean, you could do a whole thesis. You could I think this model, has some suggestions of a hypothesis that you could really build out and really, with data, but it does start with a hypothesis, right?
Absolutely.
And then you have to decide if you want to validate it.
Well, this is something we should follow up on. I think, and we have some graduate students that may be interested in topics for their thesis.
And let's not forget, we have the fall class, so you can already pencil yourself in, Lionel.
Okay, no, I'm in.
I already want you in our fall class because we're doing this again in the fall. So.
Okay. Sounds good.
Thank you very much.
It was really nice meeting you. It was a pleasure. Thank you for sharing this and sharing your path on your book and how you got to where you were. And we can't wait for the students to see this. Of course, if they're seeing this now, they are seeing it. But I can't wait to share this with them. And I'm just thrilled you joined us. And now we'll look forward to you joining us in the fall.
Okay. Thanks, guys. I appreciate it. Thank you for inviting me.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
If you think about, omnichannel, and I think, Dave, your point is if you think about basic business strategy, it's about connecting opportunities in the marketplace, connect the consumer opportunities, the customer opportunities with the resources and assets that we have as organizations. And, if I look at the consumers are changing. Consumers are a moving target. What they want is influenced by learning new technology, different generational groups, different groups in the marketplace. So it's a continually moving target. And what do we need to do with our supply chains to be able to address that? We certainly have seen that with COVID. I mean, COVID is, created havoc with the restaurant supply chain. So I'm sure that a lot of the manufacturers are looking at DTC as as a way to have more control, since they lost control or have diminished control over the restaurant channel. And then, their channel control over retail is changing as well. As we talked about before, the manufacturers, the P&Gs of the world, used to be the big dogs when it came to consumer information, until retail, like with 8451 and others, started having better information than some of the manufacturers had. Now maybe this is a way for manufacturers to get a little bit of control back by going D2C, because I think you can make a pretty good argument that a big part of value today is in the information.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's all in that consumer information.
Yeah.
I mean,
my comment on that was, I think back to, I guess 15, maybe 20 years ago, when category management first surfaced as a way to understand consumer behavior better. And it's almost, I'm thinking almost like thinking about the consumer decision tree again. I mean, not only what are they buying, but where are they buying it? And, it's almost like a whole different avenue of approach to understanding, who the consumer is, why they're looking at an omni-channel, why they're looking at buying direct. Is it a demographic difference? Is it an age difference? I mean, I can see, my generation maybe not being, not me particularly, since my world is data, but looking at, what part of our society is looking at buying differently? Why? Is it easier? I mean, what constitutes success? And then how does that impact traditional? In terms of, who's shopping, and do we look at formatting differently? Is there a way to, interact with families differently and offer up an opportunity to buy differently, via, we do that to some degree, but, it opens up a whole door to me in terms of studying who the consumer is and checking with them as to, why they're buying differently or where they're buying differently. And then, how does traditional retail react to that? Right now we're tracking, I think one of the questions that Craig surfaced is, collecting data. And I mean, to be able to offer that kind of analytic information to retailers, you got to have a data source. And right now we've got a customer, for instance, that's a wholesaler. And so we're tracking the sales, we're tracking we're tracking by salesperson, we're tracking it by commodity, we're tracking it by category. And so, it's a whole different effort for my company to be able to determine who's buying by even different type organizations, supermarket chain versus convenient versus bodegas. I mean, so all of that tracking is really important to looking at, I think, how the consumer decides where they're going to buy.
So this is something I think is interesting for us too. I mean, this gets back a bit to Dave, your world. Every major consulting company I know, I follow Deloitte, I follow Ernst & Young, I follow Nielsen, I follow the Hartman Group up in Seattle, and a number of others, McKinsey, all have ongoing collections of how consumer buying behavior is changing today. Monthly surveys of large samples of customers. In fact, it's global data. It's not just US data, it's global data, how customers are changing, how they go to market and shop, given the changes in the world. What maybe is something that we can do, and maybe this is a contribution from the academic side, is how do we integrate all of this into telling a story? So, you have data from retail level data, but there's all this data that's flowing, in this larger world around us. How can we bring those worlds together so that one of your clients or, any of the companies that we're working with get some insight from us on this. I think it's interesting. I'm amazed at the amount of data that are out there about this.
I mean, we see a lot of, excuse me, changes in package purchases. I mean, people aren't buying little packages so much anymore. The trend has been to buy larger sizes. I mean, 24-pack bathroom tissue or 24-pack paper towels. I mean, there's changes in consumer behavior that really relates to changes in how manufacturers are packaging products. So it's a whole world of change and interesting to collect data and to take a look at how patterns are changing from manufacturer side to the consumer side.
That data is growing too. One of the things I was taken by Lionel in his presentation when I asked him a particular question about explaining omnichannel in general, but he said this book went back to hundreds, if not thousands of years ago, to bazaars, if you will, when people gathered to sell. And my first thought was, well, that hasn't changed. I mean, the hottest thing out there are farmers markets, right? And then I thought, well, what has changed? Nothing. All of this is going to, it's just more and more layers are being added on top of it to where it's still all relevant. It's like stores aren't going to go away because online became an opportunity. They might change, as Tom explained with Kevin about, or Kevin did about Stu Leonard's or something, where you go less SKUs per store or something, but it's all still there. The choices for the consumer are just growing, and then which means the data on how they're shopping, where they're shopping, why they're shopping, the journey, that's all growing.
So I did. And when you sort of track the consumer, as Sid was saying, you know, to me, it's all your Cub Reporter questions: the who, why, what, where, when, and how they're shopping. I mean, that basically, if you capture that, you know, you're capturing a lot, but you got to keep asking all of those questions. So, you know, one of the things that I'm interested in, Craig, I've talked about this for a long time, is that every study I see sees one of the key motivations that's becoming more important today for consumers is convenience. And my take on that, what convenience means today is not what convenience meant 5 years ago or 10 years ago. Convenience meant how long did it take me to drive to a store? You know, I mean, the whole sort, because our lifestyles are different than they were then. So we need to sort of reinterpret the motivations and understand, you know, how to get the product there in front of a customer.
Especially post-COVID, which is
Post-COVID,
totally changed the convenience model.
And farmers markets have been around forever, but paying with your mobile phone at a farmer's market hasn't.
Right.
So you have this this interaction of technology with new forms of competition and changes in how buyers perceive value and what drives them.
Well, that's why I wanted to ask Dave too. I was really curious. I thought of him a lot in Lionel's presentation about omnichannel, because I could be accused of looking at Dave's business in the past when I was a box boy at Thriftway. Oh, that's the guy that represents the brand coming in the store, and that's all they do. They represent brands to retail store. But last week with Kevin, Dave, you started to kind of open the kimono a little bit and say, well, if they bypass and go direct to consumer, it is not going through us. And yet we're looking for ways in which we can help facilitate and grow. I don't know if you're comfortable with this, but I'd love to put you on the spot and ask you this. Where do you see that sector of the, what some people would think is the manufacturer representative, even though we all know your job is much bigger, much bigger and broader than that. Kind of where is that going? You are that middleman, that middle person, that middle company. You're part of a very, very, very large national company that does this, and you represent very large brands. What's that growth opportunity in Omni for you?
Well, I mean, it is, I guess, diminished value from our end, right? Where if you're going direct consumer by the manufacturer, you're bypassing the role that we play and the role that we play as advisory on what is the consumer insights and the behaviors and the switching and the programs to support the program. I get why a consumer would do that. I do. I see the value in that. And they were, I think under the current conditions, we're looking for ways to get products out without the complexity of some of the things we've talked about in this class, which is the supply chain component of it. You're not dependent necessarily on multiple touch points. So I guess how we're trying to interact with that is there a way to measure it? Is there a way to measure it? Is there a way to be compensated for it as a service agency? I'm not sure, because if you are going from the manufacturer direct, what influence do we have? So there could be diminished value, still trying to construct the revenue model in that relationship, but I could see it expanding. But I go back to what we've all been saying is online purchases through some form of channel, as well as going into a store, is not going to go away. It may shift the pie chart, maybe even more dramatically in the future, but it's not going away. So we'll still play a role in that relationship. But I go back to how can you put this all together into a meaningful, articulate, understandable model.
It's
Well,
also,
that had me asking that question. Is it easier for you to become more of a net rush than net rush is to become you? In other words, they be really kind of, I'm going to just, in layman's terms, they became Impact Group, but only to Amazon. Only in that relationship between manufacturer and Amazon to consumer. You have been this broad. Is it easier for you to become, is that a future in your business of omnichannel where you are more of a net rush, to use an example students or others may be familiar with? Yeah,
I could foresee that as a future relationship. Needs more development, right? And maybe some, I don't want to say testing, but just proof of concept, right? And I'm the advocate of rather be the first person through the new door than the older person through the old door. So I'd rather see the progressive side of change, but it really boils down to where do you fit in that relationship, and can you monetize it? Because unless you're a nonprofit business, you're a for-profit business. Yeah. I tie it back to Tillamook. Yes, they're owned by the farmers, but there is a profit model. So if the decision is made to go direct to the consumer, they've looked at all their different models and said, this could be another channel that we will go through and route. And now we have to see how we can fit into that relationship.
I thought it was kind of interesting listening to him talk about how the traditional retail model reacts to all of this. And there was some I remember him surfacing, what if the store reformats? I mean, should there be a center of the store that's differently posed or proposed to the consumer than it is now? And, looking at the strengths that, of course, my world comes from retail. So I'm, interested in the reaction. Do we sell fresh more? I mean, is there more of an emphasis on the perishable departments, and do we format the store? I think Lionel surfaced something about putting the produce in the center of the store. And typically supermarkets arrange peripheral departments around the store so that the customer has to shop all of those departments. But, how do they emphasize the strengths? What about the social component of people going to the store to, stop and have a coffee in the coffee bar or have lunch in the deli? And what does that mean? And is that a factor that, supermarket retailers and then more traditional avenues for purchases are thinking about? They gotta be. I'm sure that we are, or they are.
Well, the question I might have too about, particularly as we look at maybe this D2C and implications for omnichannel, what categories in the store would be more likely to leave?
Yeah.
We saw that with the box stores. We saw a lot of categories, pet food, paper products, be significantly diminished. Or I can think of, if I think of omnichannel too, if I think of an industry where I see very strong both, direct to consumer as well as in store, would be with beverages like wine. I mean, pretty much every winery I know is building wine clubs and a bigger, a direct to consumer business. But I look on the retail side and the amount of space, the amount of merchandising for wine for most retailers has gone up dramatically. And,
Yeah.
how does that work?
I mean, to me, I've watched the percentage of each of the categories or each of the departments grow. And I mean, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago, wine probably represented 5% of total sales. And now it rivals often if there's a good wine department, and usually, the tracking is including beer, but I mean, it rivals produce now in sales, to say nothing of the space on the shelf and the emphasis on local, which I'm not sure how well Omni functions under that area. I mean, I think that the advantage that, local stores have is the opportunity to really promote and maximize local products, which would be fresh, which would be, wine as an example. Yeah.
So what did you guys think of Lionel's quadrant and the way he laid it out? Any thoughts there about it? Well, you certainly heard Tom argue with whether a Philip Patek belonged in the quadrant it was in, which, we certainly had quite a bit of a healthy discussion about that. But this does happen to be the assignment the students are going to have, the quadrant, and discussing that. I'm just curious if anyone had any thoughts about, because I've got a question I could ask you if you don't have thoughts about it that would force you. Go ahead.
Well, I'll share just a quick, I guess, example is most was under your own interpretation, right, of what you believe, right? But I go back to Sid's, category management explanation about, what role does it play? It goes back to your interpretation. Some viewed it as something, somebody else viewed it as another. Now, you could see it from both sides. So it just seemed like the examples we were coming up with, you could argue it could be fit into different quadrants. So as long as you're open-minded enough to say, that's how dynamic this really is. It's not a, one-stop, this is the way that it is. It's very fluid, I guess is the way to look at it.
So my argument is that I think it's hard to fit shopping behavior into 2 dimensions. I think that it's cool. I love, these 2-dimensional charts, but I would ask, and maybe this is something for students to think about, is there some other dimensions, a 3rd dimension or, potentially others that would make this chart maybe a little bit more effective? You trade off complication. It's a 2-dimensional model, which is cool, simple. But, sometimes you trade off relevancy by making it simple.
It's true. Could you think, did it come to you at all to think about what product or what category, what product, even think of a brand, is it possible for a brand to fit in all 4 of his quadrants?
I mean, I do. I mean, it depends on the consumer, right?
Yeah. Yeah, based on what Dave just said, it's just if it's open to interpretation, you can find someone putting almost the same product in any one of those 4 quadrants, depending upon what the value was to them.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it comes from the consumer's definition. And you said, I think you would agree in category management, we all have ideas on what product should fit what category, but whose idea is most important? It's how the customer shops. It's how the customer sees what you're offering and how the customer fits that into the customer's category.
Yeah. I think about our introduction that always has the lady in front of the aisle. And Craig goes back to that. I know pretty much every class we've ever had. And it really is all about the consumer and, her needs, depending on the mix of her family, depending on the diversity of the family, depending on the part of the country. It's just, You know, it's wide open, which makes it really fun and exciting and a challenge.
Yeah.
And Craig, I mean, to your point, I think that if I think about store layout, you know, when I first sort of got involved with supermarkets, you know, store layout was by temperature. You know, you had, and it was basically, this is a very sort of vendor driven, but, you know, what was the layout that was easiest for the electrical layout, for the cold storage layout, for replenishing products behind a, you know, if you think about in the back of the store, you go from a storeroom that may be temperature controlled to put it into a cabinet that is temperature controlled. It's real easy to reach in from the back and restock. So that functions, but that may not be how the shopper shops. So it's really, again, looking at how do we bring together what the customer, what she wants, and how she shops and how she organizes her shopping to what makes sense from a vendor, logistically.
And once again, Tom, I know, and Sid knows and Dave knows, we say she because we all know she's 85% the decision of consumer products, not because we're being gender specific. We're just talking about the one gender that is all the power in America.
Right.
I've heard the statistic 65% globally. An amazing statistic when you think globally, the power of women and why we say she.
I personally love that.
Yes, of course you do. And Sid would finish that with, by the way, the other 15% guys, I just let you think you had a decision. Right. That's the line. Well, before we get into the assignment, which is next, I just want to ask one question, only because we were talking about Tom said he follows Hartman, he follows Deloitte, he follows Gartner, he follows McKinsey. McKinsey just today and the weekly, you know, the one piece of good news for the students, if you can sign up to Deloitte and McKinsey and on and on and on, they're giving out free data, global data.
And we gave them the websites the first class.
Yes, but what's that?
We gave them the list of websites the first class.
If you're not doing this, you're crazy, because this stuff is coming out daily, and it is stuff we used to pay a bloody fortune for.
Absolutely.
And we're not at all. And just today, we all knew that e-com was growing. Everyone here knows e-com's growing because of COVID. But the statistic McKinsey showed today was we are 10 years ahead of projections, 10 years and 3 months ahead of projections of penetration of e-commerce purchase because of COVID. COVID has driven the growing percentage of acceptance of buying online on a regular basis. Everyone in America now globally has driven it 10 years and 3 months. Is there anything else you can think of from your industry, your perspective, that COVID is affecting in that way? It doesn't have to be 10 years and 3 months, but what do you see that you think has changed and not going back?
Well, I think one, you know, if I were a brand marketer today, right, which in a lot of ways I am, but the students are doing this for their team project, it's not just about an omni-channel, it's about the omni-consumer, right? So you have a multiple array of consumer types and how they're purchasing. I would argue there's omni-location. You have to factor that in today. If you're working from an office, if you're working from your home, if you're working from a remote location, if you're traveling, all of those things you have to consider in your brand marketing approach. It's not a macro economic strategy anymore. It is target market to all of those different multi-layered omni-channel location consumers that you have to evaluate, and how you can grow your business through those different platforms.
Excellent. Great point. Anyone else want to jump in? That's a great point, Dave. Okay, then I'll tell you what we're going to do. We can let Dr. Gillpatrick set up the assignment for this week, which is based upon omnichannel and Lionel's quadrant. Are you prepared and wanting to set that up for the students, Tom, or do you want?
Well, I wasn't prepared at this moment to do that, but
Hey students, as you can see, I was having a little fun at Tom's expense. So there is an assignment for week 6. It will be our 4th and last assignment. And then of course, next week, you're working on your end of the semester project, which comes in 2 weeks, the presentation. So don't forget next week what we announced here, that Dave will be having office hours, which you're about to hear, so that he can go over any questions that you may have related to your end of the semester project, your group project. And he will do that next Wednesday at 5:15, and we'll make sure that's posted on D2L, as is again assignment number 4. Go to D2L, you'll see it posted there in the same document that gives you the links to this week's week 6 omnichannel with Lionel Binnie.
yes, well, again, a big thank you for Lionel Binnie for sharing his ideas on omnichannel. This is the future of retail. It's the future of shopping. It's evolving every day, and I'm really looking forward to what the class has to think about what their view of the future is.
Excellent. And next week, we get the view of the future and the present from a real brand. We've got Todd Cornwell from Franz with us, who's going to explain how has all this affected a real brand, which is a staple bread every day. So it's going to be a really fun class next week. And I hear rumors of office hours. There might be some office hours for asking those questions, especially of Mr. Tillamook, Dave Cleveland, and his ability to answer your questions on those final projects, which we will also consider getting the schedule out of who's presenting when, correct? That's coming up because we're about 2 weeks out from that.
So logistically, next Wednesday, a week from this week, you'll have an office hour at 5:15 Wednesday night. Dave Cleveland will be leading the lead. So if you have questions on your project, he's the man.
Great.
Excellent.
I'll look forward to it.
It's going to be fun. Great. All right. Well, until then, or as the Germans say, auf Wiedersehen.
Yeah.
See you
Bye-bye,
guys.
everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.